this macro-isation really runs along three separate but interconnected threads. The first of those threads is governments who have been making some pretty significant commitments around climate and sustainability, and importantly, making commitments in terms of bond issuance. So, Caroline, can you walk us through what is happening at the sovereign level and what we should expect to happen in 2021?
Firstly, thank you very much, Jim. And yes, I think 2020 is going to be renowned for the year that actually the green and social bonds have gone mainstream. It has been incredible to see the growth of issuance. We've hit a trillion outstanding. And, for, let's say, the last couple of years, the social bond has tended to be slightly I would say, the poor cousin to the green bonds. And so as a result, it was always sort of lagging behind. In 2019, there was only about 8% of issuance in the total market, versus this year, it's now up to about 25%. Now, that has obviously been driven very much also by the EU as it's come into this market in full force. As you can see, we are now expecting for 2021 roughly 650 billion of new issuance. Now, I have to say, we couldn't have foreseen the EU SURE program or the NGEU program when we were doing these numbers at the end of 2019. So I think there's obviously some scope and some movement, but obviously there's going to be significant supply from the sovereigns. We've obviously seen that already with Germany coming to the market with their twin bond. And now there's going to be further issuance in the 30-year to build out their yield curve. The UK has announced its intent to build out a yield curve in the sterling market with issuance in 2021. Spain, Italy, Austria, Slovenia are all in structuring mode, putting their frameworks in place. And Denmark is looking at an innovative structure, looking at certificates. So now you put all that together, we're actually going to see roughly a 60% increase in SSA issuance. That'll be coupled with almost a doubling in the corporate space and roughly a 60% increase in the FIs. One area that should not be sort of neglected or considered maybe not as visible is actually the municipality and the local governments. Because as the climate ambitions of these countries take hold, municipalities and regional governments will be brought in to actually help put in the respective infrastructure. Now, in this, obviously the EU is going to play a huge role. Their SURE program was announced at 100 billion, and the pending NGEU program is at roughly 235 billion, of which 30% is green. So I think, the dynamics between green and social will continue. There will be a balance. Undoubtedly, there is probably greater demand given some of the green bond funds for specific green bonds versus either a mix of sustainability or a pure social bond. But nevertheless, it is interesting to see this market just grow from strength to strength and really become mainstream.
So the governments are committing and committing in some size. That commitment has coincided with central banks who are also starting to play a role in green finance. So Imogen, walk us through what central banks are doing and how that complements what we're seeing from the sovereign side.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I think you're right. 2020, one of the big themes that we've seen with central banks is them really committing to make climate change part of their central strategy. And that's been a global theme. We've seen it from the ECB, where, Lagarde's committed that climate change will be a central pillar of their strategic review. And we've seen it from the Fed, saying that they will start to think about how they can make climate change part of their framework. Well, what that means in practice is still quite unclear, I think, at points. Obviously central banks can take account of climate change related risks in their forecasts for inflation and for growth. But I think that they can also go one step beyond that. And that's what we'll start to see more of in 2021, is about how they can support the growth of the sustainable finance market in a way that means green finance is preferential and lowering that hurdle rate to green financing. The most obvious way that they can do that they already are doing, certainly in the case of the ECB, is to buy more green bonds. Although, of course, they have to be careful about treading a thin line, I would say, between interfering with fiscal policy and also crowding out private investors. But there's much more that they can do beyond that, beyond just buying green bonds, which I think is what we'll start to see more of in 2021. So consideration of things like whether they could lower the haircut on collateral for green bonds, so they kind of boost the attractiveness that way, or even go as far as offering banks that are perhaps greener in their own financing or lend to greener projects, offering those banks more advantageous terms. So in the case of the ECB, that could be done through TLTROs or the Bank of England's term lending scheme, the similar TLTRO option. So there's a number of things available, and I think in 2021 we'll really start to understand more about how central banks kind of use those tools at their disposal, and certainly the ECB strategic review will give insight into how the ECB are planning to make climate change a real part of its strategy.